In the months since Donald Trump won the U.S. presidential election in November, policymakers in Beijing have been looking to the next 4 years of U.S.-Chinese relations with trepidation. Beijing has been expecting the Trump administration to pursue tough policies toward China, potentially escalating the two countries' trade war, tech war, and confrontation over Taiwan. The prevailing wisdom is that China must prepare for storms ahead in its dealings with the United States. Trump's imposition of 10% tariffs on all Chinese goods this week seemed to justify those worries. China retaliated swiftly, announcing its own tariffs on certain U.S. goods, as well as restrictions on exports of critical minerals and an anti-monopoly investigation into the U.S.-based company Google. But even though Beijing has such tools at its disposal, its ability to outmaneuver Washington in a tit-for-tat exchange is limited by the United States' relative power and large trade deficit with China. Chinese policymakers, aware of the problem, have been planning more than trade war tactics. China's preparations roughly mirror the Biden administration's China strategy of invest, align, and compete, which involved investing in U.S. strength, aligning with partners, and competing where necessary. Beijing's playbook for riding out the Trump years, meanwhile, focuses on making the domestic economy more resilient, reconciling with key neighbors, and deepening relationships in the global south. Trump may well be able to score some short-term victories, but Beijing's plans look beyond him. Beijing's push for reform is not just about fixing domestic economic problems either. It is also an effort to open up new opportunities for international trade. In discussions with members of the U.S. policy community after the November election, Chinese interlocutors expressed interest in fulfilling the Phase 1 trade deal signed by Beijing and Washington in January 2020, which would see China purchase $200 billion worth of U.S. products. They even brought up the possibility of beginning Phase 2 negotiations, which would focus on structural reform, including measures addressing the relationship between the Chinese government and state-owned enterprises. China is also looking to diversify its trade options. Over the past few months, statements from the Chinese Foreign and Commerce Ministries have referred repeatedly to China's effort to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the 12-member trade agreement that succeeded the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which stalled in 2017 after the United States withdrew. Members of the CPTP must meet stringent entry requirements, which in China's case would require serious structural reform. Beijing recognizes the value of multilateral trade mechanisms. China's accession into the World Trade Organization in 2001 was probably the single largest factor in China's economic rise. China's preparations for Trump have also involved a diplomatic push. In anticipation of heightened tension in the Indo-Pacific, China has tried to tie up loose ends with India and Japan, two neighbors with whom China had turbulent relationships for the past several years. Stability in China's immediate neighborhood will minimize distractions for Beijing and could undermine U.S. efforts to push its partners to pressure China. Improving ties with both Japan and Australia, too, is a way for China to ingratiate itself with the leaders of the CPTP. The thaw in Chinese-Indian relations has been notable. In October, China and India suddenly reached an agreement to disengage in the disputed border territory of Ladakh after a 4-year military standoff. Following Trump's election, China invited Indian National Security Advisor Ajit Doval to Beijing for talks about border issues. Doval was even granted a meeting with China's Vice President Han Zheng, an unusual move and a gesture of goodwill. China offered concrete deliverables to India during the visit too, including allowing Indian nationals the right of passage to resume pilgrimages to Tibet, cooperation on shared waterways, and trade between the two countries at the Nathula Mountain Pass. More important, China pledged to pursue a fair, reasonable, and mutually acceptable package solution to the border issue. Beijing has long deferred a comprehensive agreement on the Chinese-Indian border, a deal New Delhi wants as it believes that keeping the dispute alive gives it leverage. But now China seems willing to commit. China has made progress with Japan as well, hoping to improve relations with the United States' most important ally in the region. In September 2024, Beijing announced that it would gradually dismantle the import ban on Japanese seafood it had imposed in August 2023, after Chinese leader Xi Jinping met with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba on the sidelines of an Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in Peru in November. China restored visa-free entry for Japanese visitors, and China-Japan ruling party exchanges, which began in 2004, but have been suspended for the past 7 years, resumed in January, with China hosting a Japanese delegation in Beijing. During that meeting, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi reportedly proposed that Ishiba visit China during the 2025 Asian Winter Games, which China will host. At the same time, China has been making overtures to Australia, unilaterally announcing in late November a 30-day visa-free policy for Australian nationals visiting China. It was not until Trump's return became a real prospect that Beijing started focusing on outreach to these U.S. partners, but when faced with the uncertainty that a second Trump presidency could bring, China set out to improve its relations with both countries. China has options for a direct response to additional tariffs or other trade measures Trump may impose. Its toolkit includes export controls, sanctions on U.S. companies, Chinese currency depreciation, retaliatory tariffs on U.S. exports to China, and more. Which of these measures China deploys and when will depend on what Trump decides to do. Unlike its largely reactive approach during Trump's first term, however, this time around Beijing will have not only a tactical response, but also a bigger strategy. Ultimately, China hopes to use Trump's policies to its own advantage. Chinese leaders could use a U.S.-instigated trade war to rally various domestic interest groups around meaningful reforms at home and to expand ties to countries the United States alienates, strengthening China's position in a reoriented global trade system. Unlike in 2016, China's leadership also knows what to expect from Trump in his first term. Trump showed Beijing that nothing was off the table. His administration broke taboos when it came to discussing the Chinese Communist Party in Taiwan, and it disproved the assumption that U.S.-Chinese relations would not sink below a certain floor. That experience has prepared policymakers in Beijing to take seriously the possibility that the U.S. administration will impose ruinously high tariffs on all Chinese goods or seek to advance U.S. relations with Taiwan. Having witnessed the freefall of bilateral relations in 2020 after the outbreak of COVID-19, Chinese leaders can't help but feel they have already seen the worst. In effect, Trump has lost the element of surprise. After 8 years of learning and preparing to mitigate the negative repercussions of Trump's policies by investing at home and building partnerships with the global South, Beijing believes it can endure a turbulent U.S. presidency. Yet Chinese leaders remain confident that, even if the country's economy suffers, 4 years of Trump is unlikely to send it into a full-blown crisis. And they anticipate that if Trump follows through on his declared policies, such as those on trade and territorial expansion, he could do severe damage to the United States' credibility and global leadership. Beijing thus sees Trump's second term as a potential opportunity for China to expand its influence farther and faster. In this view, competition with the United States is not in itself the driving force behind China's grand strategy. It is instead one component of a larger process: China's rise and displacement of the United States as the world's leading superpower, what she often describes as changes unseen in a century. Beijing assumes that Washington's own policies will dismantle the foundations of U.S. global hegemony, even if it creates a lot of turbulence for other countries in the process. China's top priority, then, is simply to weather the storm.